cancer, actually 13 years later. He was one of the early ones on the curve. It's a little early. The average period is after 20 years of exposure, 20 years after exposure.
Dr. Schechter, you're at the State University of New York at Binghamton?
Right.
And how long have you been there?
13 years.
How much time have you spent in Vietnam and at this hospital over the last several years?
I've spent a few weeks in Vietnam every year since 1984, and on each trip I've worked in this particular hospital.
You made a comment as we were watching it about the public relations aspect of all this. Why were we allowed to do this, and would we be allowed to kick cameras in there into an operating room, for instance, in an American hospital?
Mm-hmm. Well, public relations and communication are now fairly important to most institutions. The Vietnamese observed what they believe is an increase in cancer, an increase in malformations, increase in abortions in people who lived in the sprayed areas, Agent Orange sprayed areas. Then they did some health studies, some epidemiology studies, which were good, I think, in many cases, not all, but in many cases for a developing country, but would not be accepted in a Western country or more developed country. They need to be redone. They need to be redone now with these expensive dioxin analysis to indicate who really has exposure and at what level. And no one was really doing that 10 years ago, so this is an area where we can help each other. We need to know what level of dioxin causes cancer, reproductive problems, immune deficiency, because dioxins are now very common in America and other industrial countries, not only from Agent Orange, from municipal incinerators, paper and pulp bleaching, smelting of certain things, PCB transformer fires. The food we eat contains certain levels of dioxin. So it's very important that we learn by helping each other at what level there needs to be concern and at what level of exposure perhaps we don't need to worry so much for American veterans and for others in our population.
Let me ask the question that probably people who are, have watched this and said C-SPAN got duped. They took their cameras into the hospital, they walked around and saw deformed children and women with cancer in the ward and these bottles of fetuses in it, and they didn't really answer the question, and this really isn't Agent Orange and all that. At the bottom of all this, can you blame what we saw on Agent Orange?
I think the answer that you got repeatedly was they believe, the physicians you were talking to, that a certain percent of the malformations and the cancers were caused by Agent Orange, but they did tell you that there were other causes. They talked about malnutrition. I didn't hear them talk about infectious diseases, but when I'm there, we go over the various causes. We believe that Agent Orange and dioxin, based on the published literature from other countries in animals and in people, probably is likely to have contributed to a certain percent of the problems you saw. Not I would guess, as a physician who's worked in the area, not the hydatidiform mole and choriocarcinoma, but other cancers, some malformations, some neurologic problems, some immune deficiency or the inability to fight infection, some learning disabilities.
There's an interesting dichotomy here. Those doctors are probably under some pressure from their government to overstate the case, and I thought they did a pretty good job of being balanced. In this country, those who are subject to government pressure are under pressure to come up just the reverse conclusions. The government policy in our country has been to understate the risks of exposure to dioxin.
What about the current political situation in this country regarding Agent Orange? How many lawsuits are there, and what kind of liability does the government have?
Well, there is a major lawsuit going on, being brought against the government by the American Legion and another organization of veterans on the basis that the study that Congress dictated statutorily be done to analyze the result of exposure to Agent Orange was never well done. It wasn't done at all, as a matter of fact. And I would anticipate that in time that litigation will lead to a court decision that the government must do that study. Meanwhile, I should report that we're always a government of interest groups in this country. The chemical companies, the paper companies bring immense pressure to bear and spend millions of dollars of lobbying effort to seek to deny a finding that dioxin is carcinogenic or has other health effects. But at the same time, people like me and the veterans groups are trying very hard to get an objective decision made. I can report that this administration is the first that has taken a serious look at it, and this President and this Secretary of Veterans Affairs have now issued formal findings that there are 4 health effects that are the result of exposure to Agent Orange. So we are making progress.
Back to this hospital that we saw, it's hard. One of the things that we feel inadequate to do for the audience is you can't transmit the smell, you can't transmit the feeling of the heat, and you also can't show the cleanliness or lack thereof. Explain, from what you're used to and seeing this hospital in your own medical practice, how is this hospital kept?
Mm-hmm. The hospital is one of the most impressive hospitals for Vietnam. However, in Vietnam, it is a third world country. It's a developing country, one of the poorest countries in the world. And most Americans would be shocked by the hospitals of Vietnam, by everything you commented on, and as well as the living standards that most people have. Nevertheless, it offers the opportunity to do the studies. Vietnam and these hospitals offer the opportunity to do the health studies which Admiral ZUMWALT mentioned. The largest population of Agent Orange exposed people in the world for the longest period of time in Vietnam, in the south. And in the north, there are people with very low exposures. So we have an ideal health laboratory to study. And it's my hope that the congressionally mandated health studies will be funded through American medical schools and schools of public health in Vietnam to a certain extent.
Can you shed some light on the Siamese twin that we saw, and why is that they seem to keep referring to it? Why was that such an important thing for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Siamese twins, which they believe they're seeing in higher levels than you would expect in the south of Vietnam, they wonder if this might be an Agent Orange effect. But I think it goes beyond that. The symbolism that they've kept Siamese twins alive and done a magnificent job surgically of separating some of these nearly impossible to separate cases. Viet and Duc, the two brothers who they described to you, where they did 13 or 14 or 15 hours worth of surgery in that hospital.
That was operating room.
Right, that was magnificent surgery, and it was really world-class surgery, despite the fact that they lack the cancer drugs and they lack everything else that they were describing to you.
Is it hard for you to keep talking about this?
No. The death of our son is now sufficiently past that we remember the happy times and have gotten over the horrifying times. And both my wife and I feel that a fine living memorial to our son is the work that we do to try to press forward this government on making the additional decisions on the other health effects caused by exposure to Agent Orange. And I also chair the National Marrow Donor Program, which has recruited 600,000 Americans to volunteer to give marrow to those cancer patients who are terminal, many of whom will be Vietnam veterans.
Are there any numbers, not the percentages, but total numbers of people that served in the United States military that may be affected by Agent Orange?
Well, I think the way to come at it is as follows. If one expected that normally there would be 1 out of every 1,000 who are going to come down with a cancer in the normal group, as a result of the exposure to Agent Orange, it's likely to be 6 or 8 out of 1,000. It's not everybody who is exposed, but it's a 6- or 8-fold increase if one goes by, for example, what we learned about Kansas farmers exposed to 2,4-D, one of the components of Agent Orange.
You were there for a couple of years. Is there any concern in your with you that you might come up with cancer with all this?
Dr. Schechter has been after me for years to get a fat test to discover how much dioxin I might have in my system. I was exposed because I was out in the sprayed areas every day. I have some of the symptoms that I suppose could be related to exposure to Agent Orange, but they also could be related to old age. So I'm not worrying about them.
If you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
I'm 71.
And are you active every day?
Yes, I still do a 3-mile run every day.
Why do you go through the difficulty, I guess you could describe it, of going all the way over to Vietnam? It's a 30-hour trip from door to door, and it's hot, and the facilities there aren't what you're used to here, and you do this every year. What's in it for you?
Well, I think we're at an exciting time in medicine. Remember, a few hundred years ago, we didn't know that there was such a thing as a heart attack or that there was such a disease as appendicitis. Now we've got these synthetic chemicals in our environment. Dioxin is symbolic of a chemical that's almost exclusively from industry. What do these chemicals do to us? How do we measure them? At what level do we need to be concerned? And we're never going to get a better opportunity, just as Admiral ZUMWALT described the American learning experience in Japan after the atomic bomb, where Americans and Japanese worked together to learn what are radiation effects. We're never going to have a better shot at learning what the effect of dioxins are in humans than we have right now, while the levels are still elevated in many Vietnamese and are not elevated in others, to learn what levels do cause cancer, reproductive problems, immune deficiency, learning disability, and so on.
We're going to have, by the way, the addresses of both gentlemen on the screen so that you can write them if you want to contact them. And we don't have a whole lot of time left. You wanted to say something?
I just wanted to point out that a recent study done by Dr. Fingerhut of the government agency NIOSH, which examined 5,172 workers in 12 chemical companies in this country, found that there was a 15% increase in cancers overall as compared to normal, and that for those workers who had been exposed for a year and had had 20 years of latency, there was a 46% increase. So I think the answer is now pretty definitive about what dioxin does.
Let me get just a little bit of biographical information here. People always want to know where you're from. Where is home originally? Where did you go to medical school? And how long have you been at SUNY Binghamton?
I grew up in Chicago. Went to the University of Chicago, Howard Medical School here in Washington, Harvard for postdoctoral work. Served in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, where I was drafted during the Vietnam War but didn't go to Vietnam, and taught at a number of medical schools in the East, including Harvard. And for the last 13 years have been at what we call the clinical campus of SUNY Health Science Center, Syracuse, located in Binghamton.
Admiral ZUMWALT, where's home?
I grew up in San Joaquin Valley of California, a little town called Tulare. I was the second of 4 children born to a mother and father, both of whom were doctors. And so I've been close to the medical profession all my life and did a lot of work with medical officers as I came up through the Navy.
And did you go to the U.S. Naval Academy?
I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1942, just in time to get into the Solomons campaign of that war, and served in the Korean War and, of course, in the Vietnam War.
What about the big issue of Vietnam, and should we still be, we've devoted a lot of hours to this. Is there something that's still in our system as a country that we need to work out? Any opinions, Doctor?
Well, the veterans who I've seen going to Vietnam seem to frequently find it a catharsis to go back and see Vietnam as a country and a people, not as a war. And I think we tend to have a fixation of a certain time in history that's long since over. Vietnam's a country of 70 million people, almost all of whom would like to have closer ties with the United States. And I think it's probably to our advantage for a number of reasons, whether